Welcome to Life in Sirens, Behind and on the Scene, a podcast by first responders. We're your hosts, Sophie,
Jamie,
and Aubrey.
The content provided in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of any medical institutions, emergency medical services, or healthcare organizations. Patient privacy is a top priority, and all discussions involving real-world emergency situations are de-identified and altered to ensure confidentiality. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional or your local EMS protocols before making any decisions regarding patient care or medical practices. Listener discretion is advised, as some topics may include discussions of real-world emergency situations. Hey guys, welcome to Life in Sirens podcast. Today it is just going to be me, Jamie. The girls are busy. They have a lot going on in their lives, and so I'm here to chat with you. What we are going to talk about today is communication. So we talk a lot about communication in EMS. It's the foundation of a good leader. And everybody listening has been asked in an interview if they're a good communicator, and we all say yes. But what does that even mean? What's the metric? Like, how do you measure something that is so subjective? And the answer is really you can't, unless you want to take these two tests, which is the emotional quotient inventory and the Meyer, can't say this last name, Salovey-Caruso emotional intelligence test. But there are a couple things that we can do to make sure that our communication styles are effective. So we're going to start from the very beginning. What is communication? So the basic definition is that it's a process of exchanging information, ideas, thoughts, feelings, or messages between individuals. It can be done through verbal, nonverbal, or written. So that's a good start, but what do these different forms of communication look like in practice? So your verbal is your spoken word. People pay attention to your tone, your pace, clarity matters. Your nonverbal is going to be your body language, facial expressions, gestures, eye contact. This is going to convey your emotion or attitude, and it's how people read you. Have you ever had someone say something, especially like a significant other or someone that's close to you, and they said it to you, but you didn't believe it because you can read them, because their body language didn't match their words? We often say that they didn't seem sincere. I don't think they believed what they said to me, something like that. And that's because they're reading, or you're reading, their body language. The last form of communication is going to be written. So those are text-based messages, and they require clear and concise language. But don't forget that our newer generations, so I would say like millennials and below, have created a nonverbal component to text messages. So you can read, quote unquote, their behavior, their body language via text and what symbols they commonly use to tell if someone's upset with you. I recently had to communicate with some people that are probably a generation above me in my workplace that was like, hey, the way that you communicate through text implies that you're irritated. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, it implies condescension or that you are annoyed. And they're like, what is that? I said, the three dots, the ... that you put after things, to you it is a space holder, like a pause in your sentence. But to the newer generation, it is being condescending. And so what they see is sarcasm. The ellipses reads as sarcasm now. And that is just a development in language when we started communicating more often through text. So why does any of this matter, really? Well, what I'm getting to is that good communication builds relationships, it facilitates problem solving, it drives collaboration, and reduces conflict. Rarely are people actively trying to hurt someone's feelings. It is more likely that they are just a poor communicator. We have a friend who I think we've already quoted him before. His name is Chris Smith. I believe we've actually used this quote, which is to be unclear is to be unkind. And that may not be OG from him, but he's the one that says it the most to us. And that's really what communication is all about. Are you being clear? And we're going to break it down into two separate things. So what are the pieces of communication? So the first one is going to be message. The second one is going to be intention. And this is when you are trying to communicate with somebody. So if you want to effectively communicate, you have to both consider message and intention. So your words, your body language, tone, pace, timing, those are all considerations. And these are things that you have to combine together in a way that provides a clear message while also translating your intention to that person. So rarely do we just step up and say, my intention is to tell you that I think you are a fantastic provider, but I have concerns here. We rarely say that to people. So our tone is what's going to imply what we're trying to intend to say. All right, so who listening, think back in your own personal life, has ever said something to someone that they care about? That person gets upset and their feelings were hurt. What do we normally respond with to them when that happens? Well, that wasn't my intention. The problem with telling someone that wasn't my intention, well, it discounts the feelings that were already hurt, even if the hurt wasn't intended. So even if it wasn't on purpose, it still happened. And oftentimes we focus on defensiveness to defend ourselves. That isn't what I meant to do, to defend our good character and our goodwill. But that's not really what they need. So the problem with that phrase and discounting those feelings is that you haven't taken responsibility. If you take responsibility for the miscommunication, it allows you to mend that relationship and move forward. So don't get stuck on the fact that it wasn't intentional. You will have plenty of time to explain your intention once you have acknowledged their hurt. So being able to admit your communication was not clear shows strength of your character instead of the opposite, which is what you're trying to defend when you say that's not my intention. Being unable to admit your communication was not clear, that shows weakness in your character. So if you have to say, well, that wasn't my intention, you're too sensitive, boom. That's weakness in your character because you're unable to take responsibility for mistakes, even if those mistakes were not intended. So instead of having to backtrack and fix things, we communicate intention and message effectively on the front end so that we don't have to deal with those uncomfy feelings. So how do we do that? This is where we circle back to our different forms of communication and we start to break them down. And right about now, you may be asking yourself, why is this important in EMS? This sounds like a relationship conversation. Well, regardless of where you are or where you work, we spend most of our time with these people. We spend most of us every third day. I'm lucky enough to do every fourth day. And that's a quarter or a third of your life. And if you can't effectively communicate with those people you're working so closely with, then it's going to be rough. So this is why we're talking about it. So different forms of communication. We're going to break them down. Your first is verbal. That's going to be your tone, emotion. You want to make sure that your tone matches your message and be aware of how emotion can affect your delivery. So examples of tone include enthusiastic, empathetic, professional, casual. Active engagement is important, so you want to use open-ended questions to encourage dialogue, paraphrase and summarize information to confirm understanding, and show that you've been actively listening. So someone tells you a long-winded story, and you're like, oh, okay, so the other day you did this, this, and this, and now you're feeling this way. And that means I'm listening to you. And lastly, you have to actually listen. Pay full attention to your speaker, the person you're talking to. Avoid interrupting or thinking of responses before the person's finished. And if you are even a little bit neurodivergent or have ADHD, like most of us in this field do, you have a hard time not finishing people's sentences, not figuring out where they're going before they're going there, and not coming up with your response while they're still speaking. It is a hard thing to stop doing because most of us have done it our entire lives. And so you have to try to keep yourself from doing things like that and finishing people's sentences. Especially with verbal communication, when you can actively engage and you use tone to keep people engaged, it's going to help also like your standing with those people. They're going to want to communicate with you and want to listen to you. An example of tone is the tone that I'm using with you right now. I am enthusiastic but clear, concise but engaged. And that tone is meant to keep you engaged in the conversation and listening to what I have to say. So we'll move on from verbal. Let's go to nonverbal. That's going to be your body language, gestures, facial expressions, other cues that convey meaning. So your body language, you want to maintain open and relaxed posture, avoid positions that can seem defensive. And we've all heard this when we talk about conflict de-escalation in our job, in our career field, the thing is that we forget that you want to use it with people that you care about too. You want to use it with your employees. You want to use it with your bosses. You want to use it with your captains. You want to use it with those people you interact with daily, because closed off, angry, like really stiff posture, that doesn't look great either. That doesn't communicate well for them either, because we're all the same. So facial expressions, use expressions that match your message or the emotion you're trying to convey. If you are sad, look sad. If you are happy, look happy. Most of those naturally come across, but you want to make sure that it isn't just distracted, because sometimes that's it. You say something, but you meant to pair it with a smile, but you didn't because you were distracted. And that's okay, and it happens, but recognize that it can be a problem with nonverbal communication. Lastly is eye contact. Maintain appropriate eye contact. You want to show attentiveness, but do not just stare at people, because if you just stare at them, it is like a weird power move where they feel uncomfy because they feel like you are trying to like read into their soul. Don't do that. It's weird. Just occasional eye contact, whatever you're comfortable with, just make it natural. Gestures, use hand movements if they're natural to you. If they're not natural to you, don't do it. It also is strange. But talking right now, I'm using gestures. So it really is what's comfortable with you, but it makes you seem more engaging. Lastly is proximity and space. Be mindful of your proximity to the person you're speaking with. If they step back or to the side, that's an indicator that they're not comfortable with how close you are to them. So let them make that space. People will rarely make space between you and them if they want you to be close to them. So read that, engage in it. It may have nothing to do with you. It may be just what they're most comfortable with. The fastest way that you can harm a relationship with body language is by closing proximity that they have intentionally created. So our last form of communications, we've got verbal, we've got nonverbal, last is written. And a lot of this comes from admin and emails and texts and things like that. So tone can be very hard to interpret through text, especially when it's professional text or when it's casual text. So professional text is much harder because we're all trying to say things in a certain way. We are all trying to like really close this gap here and sound like we are cool. But it's easier with casual text messages because people tend to say what they mean. But when you use professional text, be sure to punctuate and use appropriate language to express your intended tone. Be careful not to sound cold. Especially these younger generations, they're far more casual in the workplace and they want to interact casually. And so when you send really cold, just unpersonalized emails, it's very off-putting to them. So be cautious of that. So how do we put it all together? And this is when you are communicating with the humans. So you align your verbal and nonverbal cues. So you want to match your tone, your body language, and expressions. Be intentional in expressing your tone through text communication and through like intrapersonal communication. Seek understanding and feedback to make sure that your message is understood. So if you are intending to be kind and you're intending to be constructive, there's criticism, but you want to be constructive, then you can say, my intention is this conversation was to provide constructive criticism. Do you feel that I've done that or have I missed the mark? You can do it in a very blunt manner. It does not have to be this sneaky, underhanded thing. But you also can use your body language and your tone to convey that at the start of it. So these are the tangible parts of communication. It's what your mouth and your body physically do while we're communicating. But it's going to be kind of ridiculous to talk about all of this and then not acknowledge that there's nuance to communication. There are small and subtle things that we and other people do to convey a different message than the one our ears hear. So the first step to the nuance is to acknowledge that we all do it, that we have all had moments of passive aggressiveness. That's the perfect example for nuance. I intentionally mismatch my words and body language or words and tone to create a confusing moment in this communication. I want you to feel like I'm upset, even though I say that I'm fine. I want you to feel bad for what you've done, even though I'm saying don't feel bad. Those are moments of passive aggressiveness. And if you truly mean those things, it will come across in your tone. But a lot of us do it intentionally. We will pair, oh no, don't worry about it. It didn't even hurt my feelings, with a solemn tone. And then we will give them the cold shoulder. will be passive aggressive. In the workplace, I feel like a lot of times you'll hear like, oh, I love doing your dishes, and then walk away. Now that one's pretty stark. We all got that one down pretty well, but that's passive aggressiveness. Instead, you could say, hey, it really bothers me when you leave your dishes and I have to do them when I come on shift. Could you please take care of that issue for me? And they would be like, oh, that's clear. Ideally, they'll tell you, thank you, or they'll say, no, thanks. But hopefully we can change our communication to get out of that passive aggressiveness. So what about when it's more subtle? It becomes harder to pinpoint. This is where your self-awareness comes into play. When someone's communication with you makes it difficult for you to identify the feelings that it's eliciting versus the words that are being said, practice recognizing that to yourself. They're saying this, but I'm feeling this. If you can acknowledge to yourself that something isn't matching up, then you're closer to being able to express that to another person. A shorter-winded way to say this is the vibes are off. We've all had that moment where something's up. It's just not right. They're saying the right things. They're saying the things I want to hear. It's making sense to me, but it feels wrong. The vibes are off. That's because what they're doing and what they're saying don't match. And that's communication. The problem is that we have a hard time recognizing why things feel that way. And it's because they're intentionally, or sometimes unintentionally, mismatching their intended message and what they're actually saying. So, what do we do when the vibes are off? Well, we have to start from the very beginning of communication. Self. You have to be able to communicate with yourself. So self-awareness is the first step to being able to communicate effectively with anyone, especially yourself. And so basically, you have to be able to recognize, understand your own thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and their impact on how you interact with others. It really is the foundation of communication. It will help you manage your reactions, express yourself clearly, and foster stronger relationships. It also helps you read people and situations far better and with more accuracy. And so if you can identify things within yourself and feelings within yourself, then you'll be more successful in having conversations with others. You also need to be able to recognize your emotional state. So this is important because your emotions are influencing your tone, your word choice, and your body language. So if you speak when frustrated, that may lead to a defensive and confrontational tone. So that's something that I struggle with. I can be quite defensive, and a lot of people in my life know that. I feel like I've gotten a lot better, and they've told me that as well, but it is absolutely not gone. It's still a part of me. And when I get frustrated, I have to take a minute before I respond because I'm going to sound defensive and I'm going to sound confrontational, and that's not helping. And so because I know that about myself, not always, but I'm oftentimes successful in taking a moment and being like, I need to come back to this conversation so that way I can communicate effectively. It's especially useful for me when I am at my place of work because we all get in arguments. We all have disagreements at work in the way that we handle things. We all don't always agree with our admin. And it has served me much better to be able to take a deep breath, take a moment, and say, am I going to be frustrated and confrontational when I address this issue with them? And sometimes I don't take that space. And it's ridiculous. But other times I do, and it's been far more successful. So managing it, you pause and you reflect on how you're feeling before you engage in a conversation. If you don't have time to do that, then you can do what I do, which is just ask yourself, what emotion is this? What am I experiencing in this moment? And if you can do that, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, you're annoying, whatever it is, you are going to be more successful in communicating better. Because do I want to convey that to them? Is that what I want them to hear? Or do I want them to hear something else? So that's step one. You got to be able to talk to yourself, figure your own emotions out. You got to. So you have to understand your own communication with yourself, your emotions, everything. But you have to understand your own communication style, why you have it, and if you want to change it, because you can. So there's a couple. We're going to go through 4. Your first one is passive. Do you prioritize the needs and opinions of others over your own? Do you avoid expressing your own thoughts, feelings, and wants? I feel like we've all been in a place where we've experienced that, but for some people, this is their day-to-day communication style. This is you if you are hesitant to share opinions or concerns, you are apologetic or self-deprecating in language, You avoid confrontation. You avoid eye contact, slouched posture, things that make you small. The second is aggressive. You express your needs and opinions in a way that disregards the rights or feelings of others. Demanding, hostile, intimidating tone. Use criticism, blame, or threats to stake and stand your territory. Intense eye contact, pointing, invading personal space. Things that we talked about earlier, like if someone creates space, respect that space. A lot of times people with aggressive communication, they will invade your space intentionally in order to be dominant. The third is passive aggressive, which we chatted about. It's a combination of the two above, where you express your feelings indirectly through subtle or covert behaviors. So this is someone that is aggressive, but isn't comfortable actually being aggressive. And so they use sarcasm, backhanded compliments, subtle digs. They appear agreeable outwardly, but resists or sabotages efforts behind the scenes. Forced smile, rolling eyes, heavy sighing, things like that. This person is still going to be read as aggressive. They're just harder to pinpoint because you can't say, well, they're aggressive, because everything is really under the table. When these people make it into leadership positions, it is devastating because nobody can say, well, they're mean. They've been aggressive towards me. It's very hard to kind of dig them out of the flock because they will just do these subtle, underhanded things, and they can be absolutely demoralizing for your staff. They will create a morale issue before you even know what's happening. And so if you have somebody that has passive-aggressive communication, I would challenge you to kindly talk to them about it. Just because they have this style of communication does not mean they're bad people. It just means that the way that they're communicating is not good for anybody involved, especially them. Because if they talk to themselves this way, it's probably not good. The last is assertive. So this is healthy. It's balanced. This is where you express your needs, your feelings, your opinions openly, respectfully, while considering the needs of others. So assertive communication is going to be clear, direct, but respectful language. You want to be confident, but not arrogant. You don't know everything. Recognize that you don't know everything. Drop the ego, drop the arrogance, but you can have confidence in the things that you're comfortable in. Make good eye contact, have a relaxed posture. We all know these people. Where you're like, oh, they'll tell you how they feel, but they're not going to be jerks about it. And so once you have figured out your, I would say, communication style. So once you have figured out your communication style, work on adjusting that style to more closely reflect assertive. I don't know if you guys probably pinpointed it by now, but my current communication style is assertive. My natural communication style is aggressive. So I started out in communicating being very defensive. I would put myself in people's space. I would be louder. I would just make sure that they knew what I had to say was the right way. But that was arrogant, and it did not come off well, and people really didn't like it. I have been a happier, calmer person now that my communication style is assertive and not aggressive. So I still get my point across, but in a way that is comforting and kind and is really not going to ruffle a lot of feathers. So once you figure that out, you know what kind of communication style you have. You're monitoring your nonverbal cues. So you're figuring out if you're doing things that are the same. I want to make sure that my message and my intention are communicated via my body language and the words I'm actually saying and my tone. And I want to be mindful that these things are in alignment with each other. Another very important thing for you to do when you're trying to identify your communication style is to identify communication triggers. We talked about that I was an aggressive communicator. I still have a problem with defensiveness. So mine is that I'm sensitive to criticism. It at root makes me feel like I am not good enough. And so it triggers defensiveness. So knowing this, it's helped me become more receptive of criticism and recognize that a comment on my actions is not necessarily a comment on my character. So just because I do something that someone disagrees with or that they see as problematic does not mean that I am that as a person. And that's been really the game changer for me, is to recognize that them commenting on something that I need to improve does not mean that they think I'm a trash human, which is much better. So you want to start and continue to reflect on situations where you've reacted strongly and then later thought, I wish I wouldn't have reacted that way. Those are going to be what tells you what your communication trigger is. Once you identify it, it's way easier to manage. It's kind of like the monster that lives under the bed. Once mom comes and shines a light on it, it doesn't exist anymore. That's kind of what communication triggers are. If you know it, it ceases to hold power over you, or at least not that much. So you have to be able to identify them. So you have to recognize, after all these things, that we all have bias, we all make assumptions, and you have to be not only conscious of all of these things we've mentioned before, but you have to be conscientious of your unconscious bias and how that can affect how you interpret other words and behavior. So an example of this is if you assume that a woman is going to be passive aggressive, so you interpret a neutral statement as having an underlying meaning when it doesn't. So you want to challenge your initial assumptions and seek clarification in those moments. So if this is somebody that clearly has a track record of being passive aggressive and you've experienced it, you're in the clear. But if this is someone that you generally think is pretty assertive in their communication and it seems really passive aggressive, make sure that that's not an assumption that you made. That clearly that means something that it didn't mean. And ask for clarification. Say, was your intention to be passive aggressive? And maybe it was. And they'll be like, yeah. So also, you got to understand the impact of your words. We've talked about a lot of things except for words. And your choice of words can either build rapport or create distance. One of my favorite sayings is, I don't have a clue who said it, but it's that honesty without tact is cruelty. And there is a story that a man tells about honesty. And basically, he prides himself on being an honest man, sometimes to a fault. So throughout the years, he's taught himself how to be honest with the appropriate timing. He tells a story about one time that he had a friend who was in a play. She's been preparing months for this. She's super excited. He came to see her perform on opening night, and it didn't go well. The costumes weren't great. Her acting was over the top. He straight up didn't have a good time. He goes to see her after the show. She's holding flowers, still in makeup, clearly excited. And she asks him, what'd you think? Now, the type of friendship that they have thrives on honesty. So he has two choices in this moment. To either tell her exactly what he thought or lie. But that's not exactly true. So instead, he said, I was so thrilled being able to watch you do something you love. He didn't lie, but he did choose not to hurt her in that moment. A few days later, after the excitement died down, they went out for coffee. She picked his brain about all the things that could be improved or changed, and they were able to reach an effective and compassionate communication. And that's what this is an example of. You don't have to be honest to a fault. And it's not that you don't need to be honest, it's that maybe in that moment, it's not appropriate. And I think that we have all reached those moments in patient care where your patient is clearly freaking out and they're clearly panicking. And some providers have said, no, tell your patient the truth, always the truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. And I'm like, bro, they're panicking, they're freaking out. If they say, am I gonna die? We all know rule number 1 of fair medicine is you never say no. But you can say, I got you. I'm gonna take really good care of you. This is what I'm worried about, we're working on it. You can say things that aren't untrue. You're not lying to your patient, but you are redirecting them so that the panic doesn't get worse. And you can do that in your personal life and in your work life, where you choose to be honest, but with tact, because you don't want to be cruel. So how do you become self-aware? Ask for feedback from your friends, colleagues, mentors, honest feedback about your communication style. Reflect on your interactions, practice mindfulness. And I know that's a really woo-woo word, but basically it means you're staying present during conversations to better manage your emotions and reactions. So practice staying present, asking yourself, how is this making me feel? What am I doing here? And that will help. Honestly, practice in your patient interview. Practice being present and truly listening to them. It will help. So all of these concepts that we've talked about, every single one, it is a part of a broader mental concept, which is just emotional intelligence. It's similar to self-awareness, but it's the ability to understand, manage, and influence emotions in oneself, but also in others. And so you'll see people that you'll be like, man, they got something. They just really can read people really well. Oftentimes it's emotional intelligence. You can read the vibes. So how do you become that? Well, step 1, we already went over, which is self-awareness. Step 2 is self-regulation. You have to master the ability to control impulsive emotions and behaviors, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain your composure. Most of us are actually pretty good at that already because of what our job is. We have to adapt. We have to be able to roll with the punches, and we have to maintain our composure because you can't be chaos on a scene that is chaos. So that basically means you got to manage your stress. Stay calm, think before you speak. Step 3 is motivation. This one's hard. You have to find a drive to pursue goals with energy and persistence, and you have to have rewards that are internal rather than external. That's going to help you understand yourself better, which will help you understand others better. And your last step is empathy, both for you and other people. You have to be able to understand and share the feelings of others, recognize their emotional needs and perspectives. This takes effort, but you have to at least try to understand. It requires active listening, question asking, reading nonverbal cues like facial expressions and body language. Oftentimes, nonverbal cues will tell you far more than what people are actually saying. Show compassion, provide appropriate and proportional support. And a great way to do this is just ask, what do you need from me? How can I support you through this? What's the best way that I can be here for you? It can play out in a lot of different ways, but it most often looks like helping before you're asked to help. So in moments like this, you'll often hear like, well, they're just a go-getter. They just do stuff when it's not even asked of them. Well, it means that they can identify need. So if you can identify need and do things before you're asked to do them, then it shows emotional intelligence. So it's looking at a person and identifying a need based on nonverbal cues, and then helping with that need before they have to express that need to you. This essentially is a concept that every woman has been frustrated with her husband about, but they will tell her, babe, I will do whatever it is that you want me to do. Just make me a list. The problem is that now you have taken all the mental load, put it back on her. Now she's going to make you a list of everything she needs you to do. So she has to identify all of those things, give it to you, and now you're going to help her with those tasks instead of recognizing that it's equally yours as it is hers and identifying that need before ever having to be asked. That is where most people get frustrated in both interpersonal relationships, work relationships, because they have to ask. And a lot of people feel more seen if something is done prior to asking. And the way that plays in your work life is doing stuff that nobody asked you to do. Make it better, make things better because you identified a need. So your step 5 is social skills. You gotta work on social skills. You have to have the ability to build and maintain healthy relationships. So you have to have strong communication and conflict resolution, because every time you get in a fight with somebody, you can't say hurtful things and run away, because that's not going to fix it. So why does emotional intelligence even matter? On a personal level, it provides better self-control, improves relationships because people around you feel heard and understood, and it builds the capacity to handle stress and recover from setbacks later. In our job, I cannot think of a better way or a better thing to pursue, because all of that sounds like something we're going to struggle with. You have to communicate your own needs. And if you can effectively communicate your own needs, it leads to all of those things above. It leads to that resilience. On a professional level, you're going to be able to inspire and motivate others effectively. It fosters collaboration. It reduces conflict. It reduces emotional bias in problem solving and decision making. But essentially, it makes people want to work for you and actually enjoy working for you. People really just want to feel heard and understood. It's a part of humanity. That human need doesn't go away just because you're at work. You'll get better results and compliance from a team that wants to work for you, that feels understood, that feels heard. I've heard a lot of people say in the past, that's just not how we do it. You can't be soft here. I would argue that these concepts take far more strength to master than just ignoring conflict and instead being like, I'm in charge, do what I say. Because that doesn't make anybody better. It may fuel your own ego, but it doesn't make anybody better. And so this allows you to, one, be the master of your own emotional intelligence, but also be able to recognize other people's emotions and feelings. That is how you communicate with others. That's only one side of communication. The other part, which I would argue is more important, because people really care how you receive their communication, because people are relatively self-involved. So I want you to think that my stories are cool, and I want you to want to listen to the things I say, hence me talking on a podcast. So how do we receive communication? There are 4 ways to receive communication. The first is passive constructive. So this is a response that is supportive, but lacks enthusiasm or engagement. In practice, there is minimal acknowledgement of what was said. It is low energy, brief or vague responses. Focus remains on the speaker, but without active encouragement. This leaves the conversation burden on them. Have you ever been having a conversation with somebody where you say something, they barely answer, and then the conversation just dies, and you're like, well, this is awkward, what do I do now? That is passive constructive reception of communication. And so a good example is, I just got that promotion I've been interviewing for at work, and I'm so excited. And they go, oh, that's nice. So now what does this do? What does it cause? The speaker is left feeling unimportant and that their news wasn't valued. And this can happen when someone's distracted, tired, unsure how to respond. And what that does, it is demoralizes them. They think that you don't care about what they have to say. You don't care about them as a person. It really can spiral. And so passive constructive communication is a relatively low energy response. Wow. Oh, cool. Sometimes people will do this to you when they want you to stop talking, and it works. So don't do it on accident to people that you care about. The second, passive destructive. So this response redirects attention away from the speaker and their message. It's lack of acknowledgement of their message. It shifts focus to the receiver of the communication or another topic altogether, and it ignores their emotional needs. So an example, using our promotion, says, I just got that promotion I've been interviewing for at work, and I'm so excited. And they look at you and say, oh my gosh, did I tell you what happened this weekend? And I think we can all identify how that makes us feel. Like, you want to say, did you hear what I said? But you don't want to seem needy, so you don't. But when people ignore things that you've said to them, or they don't even address it, it leaves you feeling pretty down in the dumps, especially if that's someone that you care about and you trust. So our third style. Now we're moving into the active styles. Active constructive reception of communication is a response that is enthusiastic, supportive, and fully engaged. So it's genuine excitement and interest. You ask follow-up questions to learn more, and it makes the speaker feel valued and appreciated. So example, I just got a promotion at work and I'm so excited. That's amazing. Congratulations. What's your new role like? How do you feel about it? Are you interested in moving up in that company? Any of those will do. And it shows that you are actively interested. 4 is active destructive. That's a response that focuses on the negatives, downplays the speaker's news, or adds unnecessary criticism. So it highlights potential risks or downsides, undermines the speaker's confidence or excitement, comes across as critical or unsupportive. Example, I just got that promotion at work I've been interviewing for and I'm so excited. Are you sure you're ready for that? And it sounds stressful. That may be something that you think that they need to hear. But remember how we talked about earlier that honesty without tact is cruelty, and that you kind of meet people where they are, and then you can wait to have that honest conversation with them when you're not just absolutely raining on their parade? Yeah, that's important. That's what active destructive doesn't do. It basically meets them at their high and is like, haha, but all these lows. And you really just pull them down, and those people aren't going to talk to you anymore. So, question, which one do you think is the most beneficial for relationships? Yeah, it is active constructive. And we all know that because when people engage with us that way, we feel loved and cared about and heard, all of it. And so people want you to communicate with active, constructive reception back. But this is the tricky question. Which one do you think is the worst for relationships? Yeah, it's passive constructive. You would think that it's passive destructive or active destructive. And let's go back and review what passive constructive is. It's a response that is supportive but lacks enthusiasm. So passive constructive is the, oh, wow, cool. And so the reason it's this and it's not passive destructive or active destructive is because people are often good at writing off those two styles of communication reception. They're just being mean. They are uninterested. It really breaks them down to the point that they're like, no, thank you. a lot of times they'll communicate with this person less or cut off contact altogether. Most time it takes a few of these instances for them to be like, wow, they do not like me, and they're outie. The reason that passive constructive is the worst on relationships and can really tear it down slowly is because it leaves room for this person to continue attempting to gain your attention or engagement. So they often leave the conversation feeling as though they're not good enough for your intention or your engagement, and it destroys relationships slowly. This kind of engagement is the most toxic for relationships, and it's often the one we do unintentionally. And so when people are doing this to you or you're doing this to people, it creates a power dynamic where they have all of the power and you are just looking for it because they're harboring the response you want, which is excitement or genuine concern or questions about what it is that you're saying to them. Engagement, really. And they hold that power, and you are on the end where you're asking for those things. You're bidding for them to give those to you. And if they don't, you're like, hey, wait, but I want it. And so you try harder. And what that creates is this power dynamic where you want to keep going because you want that response, and they don't want to give it to you, or they don't even realize that they're not giving it to you. So how do we make sure that we don't unintentionally communicate this way or receive communication this way? We normally do this if it's unintentional when we're stressed or busy. And so a great way to manage this is by telling someone directly, I'm in the middle of something. I can't give you my full attention, but I would like to. Can you give me 10 minutes to finish this up so that I can be engaged and attentive and I can hear your story? Now that's a pretty professional way to say that. What you can say is, hey, that actually sounds really cool and I want to hear more about it. I'm kind of in the middle of something and I don't want to be distracted when I talk to you about it. Can you give me 10? And a lot of times people are very receptive to that because they want you to be excited. They don't want to experience bleh. They want you to be pumped about what they're pumped about. And so if you can do that and you can request from them that they give you some time to finish up what you're finishing up, your relationships will improve. This is especially true when you're in a position of leadership. You are constantly busy. You're slammed with paperwork. You've got 812 emails that are still being sent to you and you haven't opened half of them. And somebody walks in your office and they're like, I got a problem. And to be perfectly honest, you don't really care at that moment that they have a problem. But you do kind of owe them to be engaged and to listen and to make them feel valued in that moment. You can make sure that it's during a time that you can do those things. So you can say, hey, I'm right in the middle of this. Let me button some things up. Come back in here in about 5 minutes and we'll have a chat. That is perfectly appropriate. It makes sure that you're engaged, that they get the engagement that they're looking for, and that you can kind of come to a stopping place in your day and not have to halfway do one thing while you're halfway doing something else. It can be far more useful. So to wrap all this up, what have we learned? We've learned that the way you communicate with people is actually far more nuanced than we probably ever thought. That emotional intelligence and self-awareness is actually your first step to being able to communicate effectively. You have to know these things about yourself. And lastly is that receiving communication is actually really important. And the way you receive communication is how people will perceive you. And so if you can receive it with active, constructive responses, and we're not perfect. We're not going to be able to do it every time. I'm sure that people have 110 stories of me being like, cool, bruh. Awesome. Sounds good. And I hate that I've been that way, but we're all human and we've made mistakes with our communication styles. And so try really hard not to do that and to engage, or to be like, hey, I'm not in a place where I have the bandwidth right now. Chat with me in a bit. And that's acceptable too. Communicate your intentions clearly. And I think that this is kind of a way to do it. And so thank you guys for listening to me on my solo podcast today. As always, you can follow us on all of our socials, Life in Sirens, and we'll be seeing you next week. This has been Life in Sirens, produced by 3 nerds trying to bring you content that you might actually care about.